Husband left me 3 days after my miscarriage because his ex-girlfriend called and said she was pregnant with his baby and could give him the real family I never could, so I exposed him to everyone including her husband who had no idea she was cheating. I'm going to tell you a story that still makes my blood boil even though it happened 8 months ago, and I need to get this out because everyone keeps telling me I should have handled things differently or that I went too far with my revenge, but honestly after what my husband did to me, I don't think there's such a thing as going too far. My name is Emma and I was married to David for 6 years. We met in college and got married right after graduation, and for the longest time I thought we had this perfect little life planned out. David worked as a marketing manager at a tech company and I'm a nurse at the local hospital, and we bought this cute little house in the suburbs about 3 years ago because we were planning to start a family. We'd been trying to get pregnant for about 2 years, and it was starting to put some strain on our marriage because every month when my period came it felt like another failure, and David was getting more and more frustrated with the whole process. We'd done all the tests and everything looked normal, so the doctors just said sometimes it takes time and to keep trying, but I could tell David was starting to lose hope. Then finally, last January, we got the positive pregnancy test we'd been praying for. I will never forget the look on David's face when I showed him those 2 pink lines. He actually started crying and picked me up and spun me around the kitchen, and for the first time in months we felt like we were back to being the teen we used to be. The first few weeks were amazing. David was so attentive and excited, constantly reading pregnancy books and downloading apps to track the baby's development. He talked to my belly every night even though I was only like 8 weeks along, and he started planning out the nursery and talking about all the things he wanted to teach our child. I felt like we'd finally gotten our marriage back on track. But then at my 12-week appointment, something was wrong. The ultrasound tech got really quiet and kept moving the wand around, and then she said she needed to get the doctor. When the doctor came in and looked at the screen, she had this expression that I recognized from work, the same look I get when I have to deliver bad news to families. She told us there was no heartbeat. Our baby had stopped developing at around 10 weeks, but my body hadn't recognized the loss yet. It's called a missed miscarriage, and she explained that we had 3 options: wait for my body to miscarry naturally, take medication to induce the miscarriage, or have a surgical procedure called a D&C. I remember just staring at that ultrasound screen showing our tiny baby who would never grow any bigger, and David was squeezing my hand so tight it hurt, and neither of us could speak for the longest time. The doctor gave us some time alone in the room, and that's when David finally broke down sobbing, and I held him while he cried and said he was so sorry, like it was somehow his fault. We decided to go with the D&C because I couldn't handle the idea of walking around knowing our baby was gone but still feeling pregnant. The procedure was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave us the weekend to process everything and tell our families. That weekend was probably the hardest 3 days of my life up to that point. David was amazing though. He took time off work, he held me when I cried, he handled calling our parents and close friends to let them know what happened. He made sure I had everything I needed and kept telling me that we'd get through this together and that we'd try again when I was ready. The D&C went smoothly, and I spent Tuesday and Wednesday recovering at home. David had taken the whole week off to take care of me, and I was so grateful to have him there because the physical recovery was bad enough without having to deal with the emotional aftermath alone. Then Thursday morning, everything changed. I was still in bed around 10 a.m. because I was still pretty sore and exhausted, and David was downstairs making me breakfast when his phone rang. I could hear him answer it and his voice got really quiet, and then he walked outside to continue the conversation. I thought it was weird, but I figured maybe it was work calling about something urgent. He was outside for like 30 minutes, and when he came back and he looked completely different. Like pale and shaky and almost guilty about something. I asked him who called and he said it was just work, but he was acting so strange that I knew he was lying. Over the next few hours, David got more and more distant. He kept checking his phone and stepping outside to make calls, and when I asked him what was going on he'd just say everything was fine and change the subject. By evening, he was barely talking to me at all, and when I tried to cuddle with him on the couch he pulled away and said he needed some air. Friday morning I woke up and David was already dressed and pacing around the bedroom like he was working up the courage to say something. When he saw I was awake, he sat on the edge of the bed and said we needed to talk. He told me that the phone call yesterday had been from his ex-girlfriend Monica, who he'd dated for 3 years before we met. Apparently she'd been trying to reach him for weeks but he'd been ignoring her calls because he didn't want to upset me while I was pregnant. But when she heard about the miscarriage through mutual friends, she'd called to offer her condolences. And then, according to David, she dropped this bombshell on him: she was pregnant, and the baby was his. I just stared at him because I couldn't process what he was saying. When had he even seen Monica? We lived 2 hours away from where they used to live together, and as far as I knew he hadn't had any contact with her since we got married. That's when he told me the rest of it. About 4 months ago, David had gone to his college buddy's bachelor party in the city where Monica still lived. He told me it was just going to be a weekend of golf and drinking with the guys, and I'd encouraged him to go because he'd been so stressed about the fertility stuff. But apparently at some bar on Saturday night, he'd run into Monica. And according to him, they'd just talked at first, catching up and reminiscing about old times. But then they'd both had too much to drink, and one thing led to another, and they'd ended up sleeping together. He swore it was just that one night, and that he'd regretted it immediately and never contacted her again. But now she was pregnant and claiming the timing matched up, and she wanted him to take a paternity test. I felt like the room was spinning. Not only had my husband cheated on me while we were trying to have a baby, but now his ex was pregnant with what might be his child, just days after I'd lost our baby. I asked him why he was telling me this now, and he said Monica had given him an ultimatum. She wanted him to leave me and come back to her so they could raise their child together as a family. She told him that she could give him the family he'd always wanted, the family that I apparently couldn't give him. And then David said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. He said that maybe Monica was right. Maybe this was a sign that we weren't meant to have children together, and maybe he owed it to his unborn child to be with its mother. I just stared at him in complete shock. 3 days after losing our baby, 3 days after he'd held me while I cried and promised we'd get through this together, he was telling me he was leaving me for the woman he'd cheated with because she could give him what I couldn't. I asked him if he was seriously breaking up with me while I was still recovering from a miscarriage, and he had the nerve to say that he was sorry about the timing but that Monica was already showing and he needed to make a decision soon. I told him to get out. I screamed at him to get out of our house and never come back, and he actually looked surprised, like he'd expected me to just accept this and wish him well. He tried to say that we could still be friends and that he hoped I'd understand someday, but I was so furious and heartbroken that I threw a pillow at him and told him I never wanted to see him again. David packed a bag and left that same day, and I haven't seen him since. Update 1. The first few weeks after David left were the darkest period of my entire life. I was dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of the miscarriage while also processing the fact that my husband had not only cheated on me but had abandoned me for his pregnant ex-girlfriend. My sister came to stay with me for the first week because I was barely functional. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even shower without breaking down crying. Every room in the house reminded me of David and our plans for the future that would never happen. The worst part was that I kept expecting him to come back. I kept thinking he'd realize what a terrible mistake he'd made and show up at the door begging for forgiveness. But instead, I got a text message 2 weeks later saying he'd taken a paternity test and the baby was definitely his, and that he and Monica were moving in together. He also said he wanted to start divorce proceedings as soon as possible because Monica wanted to get married before the baby was born. Like he was in some kind of rush to completely erase our 6 years together so he could play happy family with someone else. I was so angry I could barely see straight. This man had promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or worse, and the first time we faced a real tragedy together he'd run off with another woman who happened to be carrying his child. That's when I decided I wasn't going to just lie down and take this. If David wanted to throw away our marriage for Monica, then I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they were. I started by calling Monica. I'd never actually spoken to her before, but I found her number in David's old phone records from our cell phone bill. When she answered, I introduced myself as David's wife and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss the situation like adults. Monica was surprisingly agreeable, probably because she thought she'd already won and I was calling to surrender gracefully. We met at a Starbucks halfway between our towns, and I have to admit, seeing her pregnant belly was like a punch to the gut. She was already showing pretty noticeably, and she kept putting her hands on her stomach in this protective way that I recognized because I'd done the same thing during my brief pregnancy. But instead of feeling sad, I felt this cold, calculating anger. Monica started the conversation by saying she was sorry about my miscarriage and that she hoped there were no hard feelings between us. She said that sometimes things happen for a reason, and maybe David and I just weren't meant to be together. Then she started talking about how she and David had never really gotten over each other, and how when they'd reconnected that night, they'd both realized they were meant to be together. She said that David had told her our marriage had been struggling anyway, especially with the fertility issues, and that he was much happier now. I just sat there and let her talk, taking mental notes of everything she was saying. She was so smug and self-satisfied, talking about their plans for the baby and how David was already such a devoted father-to-be. Then I asked her about her husband. The look on her face was priceless. She went completely white and started stammering about how that was complicated and none of my business. Because here's what I discovered when I'd done some digging on social media: Monica was married. Had been married for 2 years to a guy named Ryan who worked as a teacher and coached Little League baseball. And based on their Facebook posts, Ryan had no idea that his wife was pregnant with another man's baby. I told Monica that I knew about Ryan, and that I was curious about what he thought of her pregnancy. She started getting defensive and said that her marriage was already over and that Ryan knew about David. But I could tell she was lying, especially when I mentioned that I'd seen Ryan's recent Facebook post congratulating Monica on their pregnancy and saying how excited he was to be a dad. Monica got really agitated and said that I needed to stay out of her business, and that David had made his choice. She said that David had told her all about how cold and distant I'd become after the miscarriage, and how I'd been blaming him for losing the baby. That was complete garbage, and hearing her repeat David's lies about me made me even angrier. I told her that David had left me 3 days after my D&C, while I was still bleeding and grieving our lost child, and that if she thought that made him a good man, then she was even more deluded than I thought. I left that coffee shop with a plan. Update 2. Over the next few weeks, I did more research on Monica and Ryan. It turns out they'd been high school sweethearts who'd gotten married right after college, and Ryan was one of those genuinely nice guys who coached kids' sports and volunteered at animal shelters. His Facebook was full of posts about how excited he was about becoming a father, and how he'd already started working on the nursery and reading parenting books. He'd even posted a photo of a little baseball glove he bought for the baby, with a caption about how he couldn't wait to teach his son or daughter to play ball. Meanwhile, Monica's social media was carefully curated to avoid mentioning David at all. To anyone looking at her posts, she was just a happily married woman expecting her first child with her devoted husband. I also found out that David had been telling people at work that he and I were getting divorced due to irreconcilable differences, and that he was moving on with an old friend. He was painting himself as the victim of a failed marriage, not as a cheating husband who'd abandoned his wife after a miscarriage. That's when I decided it was time to set the record straight. I started by compiling evidence. I had text messages from David admitting to the affair and explaining about Monica's pregnancy. I had the medical records from my miscarriage and D&C. I had screenshots of Monica's social media posts about her pregnancy and her marriage to Ryan. Then I created a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, from David's bachelor party weekend in April to his decision to leave me in June. My first stop was David's workplace. I didn't work for his company, but I knew several people there from company parties and events over the years. I reached out to his colleague Sarah, who I'd always gotten along with, and asked if she'd be willing to meet me for lunch. When we met, I told her the whole story. I showed her the evidence and explained how David had actually cheated on his wife who just suffered a miscarriage, not just moved on from a failed marriage like he'd been telling people. Sarah was horrified. She said that David had been getting a lot of sympathy at work for his difficult divorce and that people had been really supportive of his new relationship. She promised to make sure the truth got out to their colleagues. Next, I contacted Ryan. This was the hardest part because I knew I was about to destroy this poor man's life, but he deserved to know the truth about his wife and the baby she was carrying. I found his school email address and sent him a carefully worded message saying that I had important information about his wife that he needed to know and asking if we could meet in person. Ryan responded within a few hours, probably thinking I was just some concerned parent or colleague. We agreed to meet at a diner near his school on a Friday afternoon. When I showed up, Ryan was already there, looking confused but not particularly worried. He was exactly what I'd expected from his social media, a nice, normal guy who probably never imagined his wife was capable of this level of deception. I introduced myself and explained that I was David's wife, and I watched the confusion on Ryan's face turn to concern as he started to piece things together. I told him everything. About David's affair with Monica, about her pregnancy, about David leaving me to be with her. I showed him the text messages and the timeline I created. Ryan just sat there in complete shock as I explained that the baby his wife was carrying wasn't his, and that she'd been planning to leave him for David all along. The worst part was watching him process the fact that Monica had been letting him get excited about becoming a father when she knew the child wasn't his. He kept looking at the photos on his phone of the nursery he'd been setting up and the baby clothes he bought. Ryan asked me if I was absolutely certain about the paternity, and I showed him David's text about the paternity test results. That's when he really broke down. I felt terrible for him, but I also felt like he had the right to know what was happening. I told him how sorry I was to be the one to tell him this, but that I thought he deserved the truth before the baby was born and Monica disappeared with David. Ryan thanked me for telling him, and said he needed some time to figure out what to do next. He asked me not to tell anyone else about our conversation until he'd had a chance to confront Monica, and I agreed. But I wasn't done yet. Update 3. Ryan confronted Monica that same weekend, and apparently it was a complete disaster. She initially tried to deny everything, then admitted to the affair but claimed the baby was still Ryan's, and finally broke down and confessed to everything when Ryan showed her the evidence I'd given him. According to what Ryan told me later, Monica had been planning to leave him after the baby was born and move in with David permanently. She'd been using Ryan to provide financial support and health insurance during her pregnancy while secretly planning her new life with David. Ryan filed for divorce the following Monday, and Monica moved out of their house and went to stay with David. I heard through mutual friends that David was pretty shocked by how quickly everything unraveled, since Monica had assured him that her marriage was already over and that Ryan wouldn't be a problem. But I still wasn't satisfied. David and Monica had destroyed 2 marriages and hurt at least 3 innocent people with their selfish choices, and I wanted to make sure there were real consequences for their actions. So I decided to go nuclear. I created a detailed social media post explaining exactly what had happened. I included photos of the medical records from my miscarriage, screenshots of David's confession texts, and a timeline showing how he cheated on me while we were trying to have a baby and then left me 3 days after our loss. I posted it on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and I tagged David, Monica, and several mutual friends to make sure it got maximum visibility. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times, and the comments were brutal. People were calling David and Monica every name in the book and expressing outrage that anyone could be so heartless. David's family, who I'd always had a good relationship with, reached out to apologize for his behavior and to express their disgust with what he'd done. His mother actually called me crying and said she was ashamed of her son and that she'd raised him better than that. Monica's family and friends were equally horrified when they found out the truth about her pregnancy and her treatment of Ryan. Several people commented on my post saying they'd had no idea what kind of person she really was. David tried to damage control by posting his own response claiming that our marriage had been over long before the affair and that I was just trying to make him look bad out of spite. But his post just made him look worse because he came across as defensive and unsympathetic. Monica didn't respond publicly at all, probably because she was dealing with the fallout from her divorce and trying to figure out how to rebuild her life. But the best part was what happened at David's work. Apparently several clients and colleagues saw my post or heard about it through the grapevine, and David's reputation took a massive hit. His boss called him in for a meeting about maintaining professional standards, and he ended up having to take a leave of absence to deal with his personal issues. Within a month, David had lost his job, his reputation, and most of his friends. Monica had lost her husband, her house, and her social circle. They had each other, I guess, but they'd also created a massive mess that was going to follow them for years. Meanwhile, I was finally starting to heal. The revenge had been satisfying, but more importantly, telling the truth about what had happened had given me a sense of closure and justice that I desperately needed. Update 4. It's been 8 months since David left me, and 6 months since I exposed the truth about his affair and Monica's deception. I wanted to give one final update because a lot has happened since then, and I think it shows how karma really does come around eventually. First, let me say that I'm doing so much better now. I went through several months of therapy to deal with the trauma of the miscarriage and David's betrayal, and it really helped me process everything and start moving forward. I also leaned heavily on my family and friends, who were incredibly supportive once they knew the whole truth. I'm still living in the house that David and I bought together, but I've completely redecorated and made it my own space. I got a promotion at work, partly because I'd thrown myself into my career after the divorce, and I've been traveling and trying new hobbies and basically rebuilding my identity as a single person. I even started dating someone new a few months ago, a doctor I met through work who is kind and patient, and nothing like David. We're taking things slow, but I'm optimistic about the future in a way I haven't been in a long time. As for David and Monica, well, let's just say that their fairy tale romance didn't exactly work out the way they'd planned. The baby was born in October, and from what I heard through mutual friends, the birth was complicated and stressful. Monica had some health issues during her pregnancy, partly due to the stress of the divorce and the social media fallout, and she ended up on bed rest for the last 2 months. David, meanwhile, was struggling financially because he'd lost his job and was having trouble finding new employment. Apparently word had gotten around in his industry about what he'd done, and several potential employers had decided they didn't want to hire someone with such questionable character. The stress of money problems and a difficult pregnancy took a toll on their relationship. According to Ryan, who I'd stayed in touch with occasionally, Monica had been expecting David to take care of everything and be the perfect supportive partner, but the reality of their situation was much harder than she'd anticipated. When the baby was born, things got even worse. David apparently had a really hard time bonding with the child, possibly because the whole situation reminded him of the baby we'd lost. Monica was dealing with postpartum depression and the ongoing stress of being essentially cut off from her family and friends. They'd moved in together right after Monica left Ryan, but they'd never really lived together as adults before, and they quickly discovered that they weren't as compatible as they thought. The fantasy of their rekindled romance was very different from the reality of sleepless nights, financial stress, and social isolation. About 2 months after the baby was born, David reached out to me. He sent me a long email apologizing for everything he'd done and asking if there was any chance we could talk. He said he'd made the biggest mistake of his life and that he missed me and our life together. I didn't respond to that email, but he kept trying to contact me through various means. He sent flowers to my work with an apology note. He showed up at my sister's house hoping she'd pass along a message. He even tried to get his mother to call me on his behalf. Finally, he showed up at my house on a Saturday morning looking absolutely terrible. He'd lost weight, he hadn't shaved in days, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping. He begged me to let him in so we could talk, and against my better judgment, I did. David spent 2 hours crying and apologizing and telling me how much he regretted leaving me. He said that Monica wasn't the person he remembered, and that he'd realized too late that what we had was real and what he had with her was just a fantasy based on nostalgia and pregnancy hormones. He said he knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he was hoping that maybe we could try counseling and work toward rebuilding our relationship. He promised he'd do whatever it took to make things right. I let him talk, and when he was finished, I told him exactly how I felt. I said that what he'd done to me was unforgivable. Not just the cheating, but the timing of it, and the way he'd abandoned me when I was at my lowest point. I told him that he'd shown me who he really was when things got difficult, and that I could never trust him again. I also told him that his regret wasn't really about me, it was about the fact that his life with Monica wasn't working out the way he'd hoped. If she'd been the perfect partner and they'd been blissfully happy, he never would have reached out to me. I said that I hoped he'd learned something from this experience, and that I hoped he'd be a good father to his child, but that he and I were done forever. David left that day, and I haven't heard from him since. As for Monica, I heard from Ryan that she'd been struggling as a new mother and was considering moving back to her hometown to be closer to her family. Her relationship with David was reportedly very rocky, and there were rumors that they might break up soon. Ryan, meanwhile, has been doing really well. He moved to a new city for a teaching job, and he's been dating someone new who appreciates what a genuinely good person he is. He told me that while the whole experience was devastating at the time, he was ultimately grateful that he found out the truth before he'd invested even more of his life in a woman who was capable of such deception. Looking back on everything that's happened, I'm actually grateful that David showed me his true character when he did. Yes, it was incredibly painful at the time, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But I'm so much better off without him, and I'm building a life that's based on honesty and real love instead of the illusion I was living with him. Sometimes people ask me if I regret exposing David and Monica the way I did, and the answer is absolutely not. They deserve to face consequences for their choices, and everyone who was affected by their lies deserved to know the truth. I'm not saying that revenge is always the answer, but in this case, it gave me the closure and justice I needed to move on with my life. And more importantly, it protected other people from being hurt by their deception. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and I'm glad I was the one who made sure it happened sooner rather than later.